Remember searching singlemuslim.com proudly sponsors Single Muslim Live.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Single Muslim Live here on British Muslim TV, sponsored by singlemuslim.com. I'm Fahima Mohammed, your host and your relationship and couples coach. A very warm welcome from all of us here on British Muslim TV, and wherever you're watching, whether it's live on Sky Channel 752, Facebook or Twitter. I want to welcome all of you to join us even in the conversation. If you wish to do so, you can dial in directly and speak to myself or my guest on 01924 231 083. Please do ask the bill payer's permission, as standard network rates do apply. If you want to message us and do so anonymously, and you can do so for free, and that's on our free message 07585835150. We have a topic tonight regarding the art of boundaries with regards to relationships, and with me tonight we have Maariya Ilyas. Assalamu alaikum, Maariya.
Wa alaikum salam, Fahima. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you? It's so nice to see you.
I know. Alhamdulillah, I'm doing well. I mean, it's been a long time coming for us. So yeah, I'm really glad to be here.
Definitely. So tell me a little bit about yourself before we go into the rest of the conversation, please.
Right. So first and foremost, I'm a corporate psychoeducator and a qualified mental health professional. I've been qualified longer than I can remember. I also run my online school, the Insight Academy, and that's sort of one area, different areas of personal development space. And I do one-to-one client sessions, again, on all things personal development and relationship-based therapeutic work. So that's a bit about me.
I love that. It's really important that we do have professionals like yourself speaking about very, very important topics like we are tonight. Now, for the audience, a lot of people don't really understand what the word boundaries mean, especially when it comes to relationships, and they think it's quite harsh, or they might be reluctant to even think about even introducing something like that into their relationship. Can you explain a little bit more the definition and, tell us what does it all mean?
Right. So boundaries essentially it's a defining line about what's yours and what's not yours. So an obvious one that people can probably resonate with is sort of my body. My body belongs to me. It's not for anyone to touch unless I give permission. And I think everyone can sort of universally understand that one. But where it becomes sort of a problem line for most communities and most people where they don't understand any longer, it's where it goes beyond that. So this is where it's your emotions versus my emotions, your responsibilities versus my responsibilities. But I think beyond this, it's really important to know that it doesn't stop there. It's so important to go beyond this and understand what knowing these boundaries is actually teaching you. And I'm sure we're going to get a chance to talk about soft boundaries and how they don't have to be harsh, but I did want to start by just explaining that it's a guiding line about what needs to be managed by me and what needs to be managed by you, especially in the marriage process. It's about what expectations we can have of each other. It sort of teaches people how you want to be treated, but also how they want to be treated by you. And as you said, there is this big misconception that it's about making these big grand demands of someone, but it's not that. It can actually be really gentle. It can be subtle. It's the way that, if I was to put it very simply, it's the way that we can live respectfully with people without our relationships feeling bitter and resentful when we feel like people are constantly disrespecting us. So often it's just that we haven't been clear enough, but about what our boundaries even are. So I think it's just a guiding line for us, or a framework that we can live by.
I think it's very important that you state that. And I think it's also important that we do understand what it means, so that we are not scared from it. Why is it important for relationships?
Okay, I think it's super incredibly important, and especially with our marriages. A lot of people enter marriages feeling like this is the one place where we don't need boundaries. It's the one place that boundaries don't matter, but all relationships need boundaries. There needs to be a framework or a set of rules about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in our relationship. So for some people that might be physical violence is unacceptable, for infidelity is unacceptable, but these are the boundaries that we set in our relationships. I sort of sometimes give this example about a speed limit. So it's a way, without it, you won't be able to measure or not if anything's been violated. So if the speed limit is, say, 30 miles an hour and you're driving at 40, you can be held accountable for speeding. But if there's a road where there's no speed limit at all and you're driving at even 20 and you're stopped and then you're told that you're driving too fast, how would this even make sense when there was never a guide or an indication about what was okay or what was acceptable? And then imagine the thing that you often hear from people, which is, you should have known. You should have just known what I wanted. You should have known what was expected. So I think that's a really, really important sort of way that I can illustrate why boundaries are necessary. A lot of people think it's common sense, but we've grown up with different backgrounds. Even siblings from the same environment have completely different personalities, and they will get into conflict. So when you bring two people together from completely different backgrounds, from completely different perspectives, boundaries help to create a safe space in the marriages and the relationships where you can operate with mutual respect, where there's no boundary violations, where there's no bitterness or resentment, or very little, or it can be managed as such.
No, I think, what you've highlighted is really crucial, because doing some research myself, I realized there's different types of boundaries. There's physical boundaries, sexual boundaries, emotional and mental boundaries, spiritual, religious boundaries, financial, material boundaries, time boundaries, and non-negotiable boundaries. Now, the reason why I'm highlighting this is that people can understand that we're not here to just set out rules, on the top of the air. They actually do mean something, and they actually mean something so that it's for both of your security, safety, and comfort. Now, you talked a little bit about soft boundaries. Could you go a little bit more deeper into that?
Yeah, so the idea, especially in modern day society, I would say that there's this big misconception that boundaries are an aggressive stance. They need to be handled assertively. I actually think that sometimes boundaries can be just in the way that you shape people's behavior through your own behavior. You can have non-verbal boundaries, especially when people have come from backgrounds where they struggle to implement boundaries. Telling somebody to go in and be demanding about what's expected, firstly, it can come off as aggressive, it can come off as combative, but people may not feel comfortable even doing that. It may feel too far apart from their characters. So, I'll give you an example. You could say, instead of saying something like, I don't care what you think, which may be a harsh boundary, you could do a soft boundary, which is something like, I appreciate your thoughts on this. It's just important for me to be the one who figures this out for myself. It's the same point you're making, but one's aggressive, one's a bit combative, which may be necessary with certain people in certain environments. But if we value our relationships, and especially with people we care about, we might want to take a softer, more gentle approach with the boundaries that we're wanting to implement.
I think it's so true what you've said with regards to the kind of terminology and language we use. Communication, people talk about that a lot, and they're always saying, yes, we need communication, we need to communicate, we need to express ourselves, but we're not actually talking about how do we communicate? What are the actual language, terminology, metaphors, tone? There's so much, around communication. So I guess you highlighting that is another way of you saying that when you are going to put forward a boundary, it's the way in which you actually even say it and express it is also really important. Am I correct?
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually following on from exactly what you said. It's a skill. It's something that we learn. And I often say that children especially, are notoriously good at telling us what their boundaries are. So a child will say, no, I don't want to do that. No, I don't want to eat that. And actually what happens is that they are successfully expressing their boundaries, but we shape them out of it. Right. So we tell them, no, that's rude. And just to give you an example, for example, my daughter, if she didn't want to eat something when she was younger, she might say yuck. And traditionally, in a lot of communities, you might get told you shouldn't say that. It's rude, be quiet and eat it. But actually, in that situation, the message that the child gets is saying what I want is wrong, not liking something is rude. But instead, I find that what may have been a more productive way of expressing is just teaching them an alternative way of expressing her boundary. So instead of saying yuck, saying, can I leave this broccoli to the side and eat more of the chicken? Or saying something like, I'm not hungry at all. Can I take it home with me? Or even just saying, no, thank you. But often growing up, we hear in society, we hear that, no, don't express what you want because it's rude. But the child doesn't understand the nuances. They learn that me having opinions, me having thoughts, me having a way of wanting to express myself is wrong. And I think that's one of the reasons why we shy away from, we get de-skilled from learning how to do it. So when a lot of people get older, they want to claim some of that back. But what you're doing is compiling that with a lot of bitterness and resentment that's been coupled along with it. And then the pendulum swings too far the other way, where they've gone from being too passive to being too aggressive. And then it takes a while to sort of stabilize and find a middle ground.
No, I think it's really it's amazing that you've actually highlighted the child scenario, actually, because as we grow up with filters, and we are obviously learning from society and environment, our faith, and children have no filters and they say it as it is. And obviously when we grow up, we have to be careful as to what is our environment and how it does shape us, and especially when it comes to our language and also the meaning that we create from it. And I think a lot of the times couples don't understand what each other mean. They really think that they do, but they don't. So I guess setting boundaries is another way of understanding your partner as well. So we are coming into a break very shortly. But before we do, can you just maybe quickly highlight why do we struggle with boundaries?
This is probably one that's going to have to continue past the break. But,
absolutely.
Yeah. There's so many reasons why we struggle with boundaries. One of the main reasons is that we don't see healthy boundaries expressed. So people's understanding of boundaries becomes, it is aggressive, right? And especially if somebody feels that they're fundamentally not an aggressive person, it's not part of their character, it might feel too far removed from who they are, that they don't feel comfortable. Also, I think the framework that we hear about how to implement boundaries, statements like no is a complete sentence. And that's one that a lot of people come to me struggling with, because no may be a complete sentence for a stranger, right? But no being a complete sentence, maybe with our husbands or wives or parents, maybe not so much. So I think that there's also they don't get that example growing up of how to implement healthy boundaries. Then society's telling them something completely different that's so far away from them. And then people are often left.
Well, we're going to continue after the break, as we are going to be discussing more into this, like you said. But we do need to go to a break shortly, and we will see you in a few moments.
With 3 million members searching, SingleMuslim.com proudly sponsors Single Muslim Live.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Single Muslim Live here on British Muslim TV, sponsored by SingleMuslim.com. And we're here with the lovely Maariya Ilyas, who is actually very, very well versed and educated with a lot of experience with regards to relationships. And we are talking about boundaries in relationships. So Maariya, before the break, we were talking about the struggles people have in order to set these boundaries. They might feel that they're actually imposing onto their partners, or it might send a negative message. How do you feel about that? Or do you think that it's more of a struggle for a woman to set these boundaries than it is for a man? What's your opinion on that?
I think traditionally women are generally encouraged to be passive and not necessarily express what they want. So what then happens is a struggle to do it in a way that's going to be well received. So there's this, I briefly mentioned before about the idea of the pendulum swinging too far the other way. The idea of having wants and needs in many cultures and communities is suppressed, whereas the man's views and opinions take precedence over the woman's. And this isn't always the case, and especially in this day and age, I think it's being rebalanced a little bit. But I think there are some communities that are still trying to catch up with that. But it is something that you mentioned a while ago about the dysfunction, and I want to just touch on that a little bit about there are some family dynamics, especially dysfunctional family dynamics, where speaking up for what you want and need is actually seen as disrespectful. Okay, and that's where it becomes a problem, because as I say, the example of the child who's expressing what they want, that they're being told that what they want is wrong, or that's the message that they're getting, rather than being taught how to. And to this, I would say that dysfunction isn't okay just because it's an elder or community or society doing it, but it's a lot of that does become internalized. A lot of women do take that on and then struggle when it comes to, especially in the marriage process, when they're struggling to say what I want, where the woman's often generally more criticized in the process, the weight, the height, credentials, whereas men do get it somewhat, but not to the same extent that women do. And I think that all of these comes under the boundaries problem that we're seeing these days.
Do you think men can handle, when it comes to certain mindsets and cultural backgrounds, that, a woman is actually speaking up for their rights? And nowadays it's like, oh, well, if women speak up, you're a feminist. And, talking about women empowerment and talking about your rights, even Islamic rights, at the end of the day is looked upon, like you said, as disrespectful. How do you think we're going to get away from that narrative and that old mindset so that we can have more successful relationships where both parties can still implement their rights, they can still speak up, but it's not taken as disrespectful just because you're expressing an opinion, just because you're saying what you like and what you don't like, what you prefer, what you don't prefer. That is not something that is disrespectful. That is not someone who is now, taking on a man's role, for example. So what's your thoughts on that? Because I get that a lot about, women who are outspoken, who are giving their opinions, that, at the end of the day, they are doing the man's job. That's what I hear. What's your thoughts?
So I wanted to touch with both the beginning of your question was about, do I think men can handle it? I think they can. I think when men have been taught to handle it, it's especially, there are many different communities where men can, but I do also accept that there's many communities where it's not as acceptable. So I think to say it depends on the man, I know that's a very vague response and it's not particularly helpful in the long run, but it does. And I think that this needs to be part of the screening process in a way, when you're getting to know someone about whether or not the person can handle your opinions and whether or not they can handle your preferences. I think the other part of it is, to following on from that part of your question, was about, I think that there needs to be a better skill level with the way that the needs and wants are communicated. So making demands instead of requests, which is often what we see. And that's where things become combative. So if we are in a situation where we're able to make requests, like instead of saying, I need you to put the bins out on Monday, it's like, okay, it would really help me if you put the bins out on Monday, if you took that responsibility away from me, because I'm taking on this side. So there's a way that things can be communicated respectfully. I do still believe that at the end of that, even though there are the screening process need to be had, the second part of it is that we all need to learn better skills for how to communicate with each other in a mutually respectful way. But I still want to highlight the point that I made earlier about dysfunction is still going to exist. If there are dysfunctional families, if there are dysfunctional people within those families, voicing your opinion is never going to be seen as okay. It's never going to be seen as worthy. And I've actually seen this for men too. There are some men who I've seen that have been forced into marriages, women that have been forced into marriages where somebody else has taken that decision for them and their opinion didn't matter. So yes, I think overall women experience this more, but I do see it from both sides of the coin. Ultimately, we also need to get better at recognizing this so that we can try and avoid it as much as possible, having these healthy conversations before we get into marriage, about what are your opinions on these, how do you feel about this, so that we're not learning on the job, as so to speak.
No, I think what you've said and highlighted again is extremely crucial. I love the fact that you mentioned about the dysfunction, as well as the fact that, you know, the way in which we express ourselves, again, comes down to communication about, you know, how making a request instead of a demand. I think all of these things do play a big part in you actually having these healthy boundaries and good communication skills. And people do need to realize it is a skill. People think that, you know, when you go into a relationship, it's just something that, you know, it just happens automatically. No, you need to understand human mind and behavior. You need to understand a bit of psychology. You need to understand how to communicate well. You need to understand how to have a bit of emotional intelligence and read your own mind as well as the other person. And I don't mean a mind reader. I mean understanding the feelings and the cues that actually happen. Now, we do get people in the community, or people generally, that are just, you know, very, very easily to just accept they're good people. They're either looked upon as, you know, maybe tolerant, a pushover, or, you know, basically someone who will take a lot. And they may not have boundaries. How dysfunctional or dangerous that can be if it continues?
Oh, incredibly dangerous and incredibly detrimental long time to a mental, physical health, the way we operate in our marriages. I say the biggest problem with this way of thinking is that it inherently means that if you are not passive, if you are not a pushover, then you're not a good person. So in these scenarios, the idea of being a good person is equated to being more tolerant and to be passive. If this is a belief that everyone around you holds, then any sort of deviation from that, any action that steps even slightly away from that, will automatically put you into the fold of being a bad person. And it goes back to what we were saying earlier. If that image of speaking your mind, having thoughts, having boundaries is so far from what you feel you are inherently, people are going to struggle with that. But what then happens is that if people don't put in boundaries, as I said, there's a lot of bitterness that comes along the way, resentment that comes along the way. You'll feel miserable when you're around certain people. And I say that this life is so short and that we have so much that we've been put on this earth to achieve. And then we're wasting a significant part of that time upset with how poorly people treat us, which ends up distracting us from all the wonderful and amazing things that we could be doing. But the main thing is that it exhausts you. You end up developing this bitterness for groups of people. Like, I hate people. I hate going to people's house because it's such a toxic place. And now it's the house's fault. but it's because you're so tired that you've created those negative associations, and it's exhausting you mentally and physically. And sort of one of the main things is that the anxiety that you get, it can cause indecisiveness, and people looking to get married. That's such a dangerous place to fall into if you're indecisive in the marital process. And long term, it causes so much stress. And to say that, obviously, we know now that stress can cause physical health problems like insomnia, heart attacks long term, and stroke. So it actually wouldn't be too far of a stretch to say that lack of boundaries can cause heart attacks and death in the long term. It's not too far removed, because you see this in a lot of elders, especially, who are really stressed at their later life, when actually a lot of those problems wouldn't have existed if just healthy boundaries were put in place. There was always an assumption, you should have known how to treat me. You should have treated, you should have known better. But everyone's acting in a way that represents their values. And when you've got different values, that there's a conflict. So instead of getting into those conflicts, it's so much easier to implement those boundaries so we don't get into those big conflicts further down the line.
No, I think, again, being really tolerant and just accepting will actually lead your relationship also into a plateau. Because, I mean, even between two people, you want someone to sort of keep you a little bit, not on your toes, but basically someone who is actually checking you and you checking yourself. And I think that actually brings a bit of excitement and sort of like spice to the relationship as well, that knowing that, you're alive, you actually have your own opinions, you actually are, making a difference, and you are changing and growing together. So absolutely, I think, having no boundaries is very dangerous. And again, it's giving a lot of power to the other person. And you need to be very, very careful about that too. When it comes to a lot of people think that, when you're thriving in your marriage, it's a lot of self-sacrifice. But where do we draw the line between self-sacrifice and having boundaries?
Right. So I think it's just probably helpful to give a bit of context for that one. So a lot of people are made to feel like you're doing the right thing by not putting in your own boundaries. And I equate a lot of movies, old-time novels as a problem, as a part of this problem. The idea is the more of yourself that you sacrifice, the more it is a representation of how much you love that person, how committed you are to that person. And you end up getting statements like, this person's treating me badly, it's affecting me, and maybe I need to step back. But what you're told is, but that's not a part of who you are. That's not a part of the right thing to do. This person is X, Y, and Z, and for that reason you have a commitment to them. And what you're getting told is to tolerate abuse from that person. And actually, but it's in that sense, when you're being told to step back and be tolerant, be passive, that advice is never about what's good for you. It's always about what's disrupting the peace and convenience of the person. Number one, the person who's treating you badly, and secondly, the person who's giving you that advice. So when it comes to the idea of self-sacrifice in a marriage, to me, it's like there will always be the art of compromise that's needed. I actually struggle with that phrase. I've said it, but I'm gonna step back on myself.
Well, it's really good that you've actually highlighted that, and I'm going to stop you there because we are going into a break, but we are going to continue, and make sure you stay with us because it's really getting really juicy right now. Really important that we continue with this conversation. So I hope to see you in a few moments after the break. Take care. See you shortly.
With 3 million members searching, SingleMuslim.com proudly sponsors Single Muslim Live.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Single Muslim Live here on British Muslim TV, sponsored by SingleMuslim.com. We have Maariya with us discussing boundaries in relationships, which is actually a scary thought for a lot of couples, whether they feel that it's actually putting a lot of restriction on them, or whether or not they feel that they're not actually free to be in their relationship because of the word boundary. So we actually go into this conversation, and inshallah, if you have any questions or queries, please do send them through and I will ask Maariya for you. Now, Maariya, when it comes to boundaries, what does it mean for the couple when it actually can actually bring about compromise and instead of conflict? What's your thoughts on that?
I think the word, I did mention the word, but I know that it's one that I generally do struggle with. And I think I default to it because that's what you always hear, that marriage is a compromise, right? But I would like to put the idea of, instead of marriage being a compromise, which is essentially somebody giving up a part of what they want for the sake of something else, I believe that marriages should be it's more a negotiation art rather than a compromise. And in a negotiation, what happens is that both sides put across what they want until you settle on a mutually agreeable solution. Whereas a compromise indicates that somebody's forsaken something that they wanted for the sake of the greater good in their mind, or the marriage, or for what the other person wants. So I think that compromise essentially, in the moment, it might resolve the problem because it sort of puts a band-aid on the problem. But long term, if one person in particular is feeling like they're constantly compromising a part of what they want, a part of what their values are, for the sake of the relationship, long term, it does create conflict. It might not create conflict in a sort of aggressive way, but conflict can also be that there's one person who's unhappy, and then when that one person is unhappy, they're not giving you what you want from the relationship. They're not giving you the communication you need. The emotional needs aren't being fulfilled anymore. So conflict doesn't have to be an aggressive fight or an argument. Conflict can be passive as well.
I love that. I think what you've just highlighted, I never really thought of myself when it comes to the word of compromise is giving up, but negotiating is actually both coming to a resolution, more like a contract as well. I think that's very healthy. And I think it's really, really important, like I said, again, to have such a professional guest like yourself, because you do give more insight, even to myself, as much as I'm learning and studying. I love having guests like you because, it's such a, enlightenment to relationships, and especially because we always talk about compromise, but it's so true. It can lead to resentment, especially if it's not being fulfilled and met, and if it's also one-sided. Now, do you think, though, on the other hand, when people, as we mentioned a little bit earlier in the episode, have no boundaries, or they have a lack of boundaries, it can actually lead to a lot of these abusive relationships, because that's when, you're not putting, your sort of like whatever you want in front of your partner, or you're not showing that you're standing up for yourself, or you actually have value for yourself. Does that actually come across in many abusive relationships, or from the clients and case studies that you have come across?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that when it comes to marriages, these things always need to be defined, right? Because what often happens is that somebody who is abusive won't admit sometimes, most of the time, that they are abusive. And often the reason why that's happening is because in their mind, their behavior isn't abusive, whereas to the person who's feeling like they're being abused, either whether or not this is physically or emotionally or sexually, it can fall into a grey territory when those boundaries haven't been.
Maariya, before we continue, we actually have a caller online. I'd love to hear what our guest has to say. Assalamu alaikum. You're live on British Muslim TV.
Wa alaikum assalam.
What's your name and what would you like to say?
Yeah, sorry. If you don't mind, I'd like to stay anonymous, but I'd just like to say...
Absolutely fine.
A very interesting topic that you guys are talking about, and well expressed by both sides. But I'm very much on the side of wording. So, for example, on the art of boundaries, for me, that word boundaries is very harsh in terms of marriage, because boundaries sets out limits and limitations, and it means you can't go left. If you touch the boundary, you can cause an argument unnecessarily. So the word boundary, and being in, unfortunately, I was divorced. It's been 13. Well, I was married for 13 years, divorced for 2. And in that journey, and this is married. The word journey. The reason I use that very profoundly is because that's what marriage is. The concept of marriage is half your deen, because it's a journey. It's a journey for development, understanding. So boundaries in marriage is the wrong terminology to use. It should be more self-development. Marriage, the issue is we have to look at it from a perspective of not cultural, but more from a religious perspective. We can't date before marriage. We have to get married. That's the reality of life. Now, the process of marriage has changed from the time I got married, 15, 20 years ago. Now it's different again. So I think what we need to focus on, rather than setting boundaries, once you set boundaries, people start thinking that's the way forward. It should be more around how do we as individuals become more better people. And that's only through self-reflection, training, and understanding who you are before you go into this. So I just wanted to make a point on that aspect, because I thought the word out of boundaries, I just thought it was too harsh, and we need to twist it on its head when it comes to marriage.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And it's a really honest conversation, actually. And thank you so much for calling in and sharing your story as well as your opinion. I really do appreciate that. Maariya, what do you think of that? Because I actually was going to come on to that with regards to the word boundaries being, as we mentioned before, it can be quite aggressive, and it can actually put people off thinking that it is something that, there you go, there's a line and you cannot cross that. But on the other hand, we are discussing that, if it's not there, it can actually be crossed. I mean, it depends on the person's character as well as to what's their intention. So what is your response to our caller tonight?
I actually agree with everything you said, and I'll first address the thing that you said about the boundaries, and then move on to the self-development thing. So the first part of it is, I think boundaries I would still assert that it is the right word. It's just about what our understanding of boundaries are. So boundaries can be permeable, right? So they can be ones. So you could see boundaries as a brick wall that no one can get through, or you can see it as a gate that you open and close. Depending on who that person is, you can allow them, you can bring your boundaries in, or you can extend your boundaries out. So I think that the idea of a boundary, and I agree with you, I think traditionally it is seen as something that it's a wall that you put up and no one can cross it. But actually the boundaries themselves are just a guiding framework, and you can adjust those according to who you're speaking to. The boundaries that I might have with a complete stranger might be different to the boundaries that I have with my husband. The boundaries I have with my husband might be different to the ones that I have with my parents. So I think one of the first steps I would say is to move away from the belief or the understanding of the word boundaries as something rigid, and rather see them as something that are flexible. We can have flexible boundaries, but I agree with you that the common understanding of that word is that they are rigid, that they're impermeable, that they can't be crossed, and that does come across as aggressive. So maybe the idea is, instead of, maybe there is a conversation where the word can be changed, but maybe the conversation should also be about, can we find a way of changing our understanding of what the word itself means?
Absolutely. I think we all place attachment to the meaning of things, and we all have a certain filter, like I said, when we're growing up or when we are in a particular way, where that can be triggering, or that can actually feel something which is, restrictive. So again, I do appreciate the caller calling in and actually talking through with us, because this is a very important point that he did raise. And as much as we need to have, because even in Islam, right, we do have rights and we do have to fulfill them. And there's certain things that you can do and you cannot do. So I guess if you're thinking about it in that way, there is a line. And so when we're talking about boundaries, I do know, and I've heard this again and again, as soon as, I've been invited on many platforms to speak. And as soon as I say, let's talk about boundaries in relationships, it's like, no, we don't want to do that. It's like as if, we're going to scare people off, or we're going to give them an insight that they shouldn't be having in order to put it. But again, if there's no issues and there's no intention for you to actually be in a particular way where it's going to actually cross someone in a negative way, then I don't see that being an issue. So we do have to go back to the meaning of what we associate certain words with and how that affects us through our own understanding of growing up and the perceptions we have over boundaries. And I think when people look at relationships and the word boundaries, for them, it's like, oh, someone's just putting a red line, a red tape, and that's it. If you cross it, that's going to cause, an argument, a conflict, or even, a divorce because, I've crossed that boundary. But like you've explained, it is not like that. It's about expressing ourselves to what limits we have, and we all have different limits, to what rights we have and how we are showing up for it, for us to even show our education and understanding as to what is ours, what is yours, and how we're going to respect each other. Again, I think when we use the word boundaries, we don't stop with that word. We have to continue with those words and ask each other, what does each other mean? And what do we see it as? So that's what I really wanted to add to it. We do sometimes feel that, sometimes we have to read people's mind and understand them. How do we get across that too, without sometimes even making it or writing it down or saying it verbally? Do we actually have a sense that we can actually understand each other, like kind of mind reading or having a sense of somebody? Is that even possible where we can set boundaries without it being vocal?
It is. Could I just, before I answer that, could I just get back to the second part of what the brother said? Because I really appreciate what he said about the process.
Absolutely.
And journey. Oh goodness, yeah, that resonated so much even with me, and I cannot tell you how much I loved that feedback, because that is what marriage is. It's a journey. As we go through different things, as we may have children, as we may go change, our health may change, our jobs may change, whatever it is, all of those things are shaping our character. And as we go along that journey of individually, we're also going on that journey with the other person. And the whole point is to constantly be in a process of refinement. And I agree. The ideal world would be a place where we're all trying to be the best version of ourselves. And I think that that's a really interesting point that you raised. So I did really want to not let that one go unaddressed, because I agree. I think if when people enter marriages with that perspective, with that mind of this is a journey, we are hopefully together for the rest of our lives. How do we do this in a way that's fruitful for both of us? And this brother mentioned it in a very kind of beautiful way about both people wanting
Absolutely.
to do it.
But we are going to actually continue after the break as we're coming up to the final one. I just want to say thank you so much for your calls. If you want to send any messages and coming through, we have time. We have a final part coming up soon. Make sure you do so and stay with us. And inshallah, we will have the rest of the conversation after a few moments. See you in a few seconds. Assalamu alaikum.
With 3 million members searching, SingleMuslim.com proudly sponsors Single Muslim Live.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Single Muslim Live here on British Muslim TV, sponsored by SingleMuslim.com. We are at the final part and I wish we had another hour or two because I can easily listen to you, Maariya, for another few episodes because it's so interesting. And I also want to thank people that are engaging and sending messages on the social media platforms, as well as the caller that actually, took their time to express their opinions and statements, which was absolutely amazing. It's wonderful that we, have people that see us having and being a safe space to share their thoughts and opinions and to have some really intellectual conversation and dialogue. So, Maariya, before the break, I was itching to ask you as well with regards to the fact that we have to maybe, set these boundaries or, talk about these boundaries or, even express ourselves without being vocal, like kind of mind reading. Can you explain a little bit more about that? Because I think you can really express it in a much better way.
I hope so. So for me, I say that nobody can mind read. And one of my biggest pet peeves in life is when somebody says, or especially when somebody comes to me and saying that they're having these sort of marital issues and any sort of conflict, it's that person should know. We've been married X amount of years. They should know me by now. And my problem with this is that if there has been a situation where somebody hasn't been vocal about what they want, that person hasn't had a chance to read or understand your behavior. No one can mind read. No human being can mind read. But what we do have is evidence from someone's behavior in the past that will be a good predictor of what they may do in the future. So, for example, if somebody's wife has come home from work, she might be very hungry, and maybe that's not a good time to talk to her. And so, but that's history that's showing you what the future should be like. And it's not that no couple ever gets better at reading someone's mind. They just get better at reading someone's behavior, but based on what the past has shown them. But when you have any couples where the communication isn't there, when the communication isn't open, and the people aren't really expressing what they want, you're not actually giving the other person the chance to learn about your behaviors. And then what happens is 14 years down the line, 15 years down the line, 20 years down the line, you have a conversation where we've been married for 20 years. Why does he not understand me? But it's like, I
love that you say that. I mean, I've always actually mentioned this. I'm like, people can live together for so many years and they do not know each other because they're just repeating cycles and they don't have a communication. And if they've been speaking, they're not actually talking about the uncomfortable things or deep related issues. So I guess boundaries is one of that. We do actually have a couple of questions that's come through, which I want to quickly address as well. I'm going to hold myself back with asking you all the questions, and I'm going to make sure that our audience get their views in first. So we have someone anonymously has messaged saying, as the topic is the art of boundaries in the marriage process for Maariya, where do we draw the line with boundaries, for example, approaching a Muslim sister and to compliment her, to tell her that she looks cute?
You only get to that point when the person's allowed you to get to that point. Never, ever start a conversation with that. That's for many women, they might find that flattering, but for many women, you will offend them. That's especially if you're wanting create a marriage with somebody who you respect and who respects you, you need to set up the relationship. You need to start the relationship in a respectful way. Approaching somebody from that perspective, letting them know that you think they're cute, I would never recommend to lead with that. I would say that once you've developed a relationship where there is open communication, where she's giving you an indication that she's comfortable accepting compliments from you, that's when the compliments come. Up until that point, show a genuine interest that I would like to get to know you for who you are, for who your mind is, for what you have to bring, what value you have. That's what I want to get to know. And then once you've gone past those deep levels, getting to the point where you're actually complimenting somebody's physical appearance, that is the next level of intimacy. And I don't think that should be granted to anyone just off the bat. I think that's something that should be worked towards. I don't know if that answers.
I am so happy that you said that, because there's a lot of men out there that have absolutely no clue. They do not have the skill of how to approach and be respectful to a lady. And at the same time, especially when you're talking to somebody who is from our faith, our background, and as well wearing the hijab, there is an etiquette, there is a respect, there is a format, there is a process. And I think you've said it so beautifully, that is a privilege and that is also consensual. You need to make sure that they are comfortable with you in order for you to actually give that compliment about their physicality. And it's different for men. Maybe they may not mind as much, but at the same time, for women, especially if you're going to approach them, you are serious about them. I think definitely rewind, take note, and at the end of the day, honestly, make sure that you use Maariya's advice if you are serious to approach a lady, and do it in the most respectful way and get to know her first and make sure that she's comfortable before you can actually send these heart emojis and these, love eyes or these compliments with someone that you have absolutely no idea. Just think about the fact that, if someone would speak to your sister or your mom like that, you wouldn't like it. You want them to come across differently. So seriously, this has come up before, and I'm so glad that you've said that. And thank you so much for that message as well. The other message is, go ahead, Maariya.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, it's just, if you just lead with the fact that is the second or third layer of intimacy,
exactly. And it's not the first. Not the first, exactly. Okay, so the second question is, in an arranged marriage, how should the two people talk at the beginning to set up the boundaries for their healthy, beautiful relationship when it comes to intimacy? Now, that is quite a difficult one, especially just generally about intimacy. When you want to set boundaries with regards to that topic, it's not easy for a lot of people that have come together for the first time, let alone in a lot of Muslim marriages where maybe some of them, they do not have that time to get to know each other. And they want to talk about these things. So how do you speak about intimacy and boundaries in the same sentence?
I think it depends on how far along you are in the process of getting to know each other. So are we talking about before marriage? Are we in the marriage? I think those things, it does make a difference about how free, not to say that these conversations shouldn't happen, because everybody needs to know what to expect. I think that one of the things that I say is, especially a lot of women feel really uncomfortable raising the topic of intimacy. So then I say that use words that are comfortable for you. If actual stronger words are uncomfortable for you, use words like intimacy, closeness, the expression of love. Use these words, and actually you get to gauge what the person has to say. But also, I think not just around the language. I think the language is important. It's about how you learn to express it. But I think there's also a question about why we feel uncomfortable having these discussions. And I think a part of it is because we don't know how to have these discussions. Maybe we can't have them with our sisters, our mothers, and so we're learning as we go along. So I say that when it comes to boundaries, with this particular question, I always say that the answer to this is have grace with yourself, that you may have to learn as you go along how to set those boundaries. And it's not to put pressure on yourself that there's a one size fits all. You test the waters about what feels comfortable, and then you go in, and then just be open to exploration about how you speak about the topic, what happens in terms of intimacy, how you have these big conversations with people. Just know that there's an exploration phase, that in an arranged marriage especially, you need to spend more time in the exploration phase.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I think that's very sound advice. And I really do thank people that have sent in these messages. And I think it's so important. And to have such a wonderful guest like our Maariya tonight to give this expert advice as well, because it's so important that we do take some sort of steps to exploration. And as much as we can have all these what if scenarios and try to pre-plan, as much as we encourage that, at the same time, there also has to be a limit and a boundary with that too. And like you said, there is a process when you're in the actual journey itself, and you need to be open to exploring that. What would be some of the practical steps that, you would advise people that now they're at a stage where they are married, or they, at the beginning stages of getting to know someone, and they want to set boundaries, healthy boundaries? What would be the practical steps that someone can use in that process?
I think my first, the first bit of advice I would give would actually ties in very closely with what the brother who called in said about actually that self-awareness is the first stage of this process. Nothing happens without self-awareness. You need to have the self-awareness. You need to know why these things are important to you. You need to figure out what your values are. And especially in a lot of communities, we learn our parents' values, or we learn our wider community's values. But actually, as we grow older, we realize that our values may not be the same as their values. So figuring out what your own values are and what values you want to take into your marriage, what you want to take on this life journey, starting there, having that self-awareness. The other point is to never assume that the other person should know that their behavior is disrespectful. Just if we all start by that basic thing, the word "you should know," as much as possible, try and take that out of your vocabulary, especially when you're in an art of learning about each other, and also accept that they have boundaries, right? And see it as a matter of negotiation and not compromise, like we spoke about earlier. Make requests, not demands, and learn the art of how you feel comfortable implementing those boundaries. So are they the soft ones, like I mentioned earlier, like let me take some time and we'll talk again in a few hours, versus something like leave me alone? So they're saying things. It's essentially saying the same thing, but it's about how you communicate it. So you also need to go on that journey to develop your own style of what feels right based on your own personal character. And I say that this is a skill. It takes time. You may learn on the job. If you need to outsource some of that help, do your research, develop it, learn through practice, and then implement that in your marriage.
Thank you so much, Maariya. We've actually come to the end of the show, and I'm really actually disappointed because I really can talk about this with you for so much more longer. But before we go, quickly, could you just tell people how could they reach you so that if they want to have more advice?
Yeah, I'm Insightology on Instagram. So you can get to me on Instagram at Insightology, and you can get to me on my website, www.insightology.co.uk.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time tonight, all of the information that you've shared with us. Inshallah, you have a really lovely Eid coming up in the next couple of weeks. And again, really, excited to have you with us tonight. I also want to thank the caller, the viewers, everybody that's also messaged. It's been an absolute pleasure to be hosting for you. And inshallah, we will be back in a couple of weeks after the Eid. Make sure you have a wonderful time with your family. And we will definitely be having a return of the show where we'll be talking a lot more with much more topics and all about relationships that we can help you through the journey and process. But have a wonderful evening and a beautiful night. And inshallah, we'll see you soon. Assalamu alaikum.